Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Bierbaum, and I serve as the director of the Edmund and Lily Soffer Center for Ethics. The Mala and Soloman Kamm Lecture is supported by the longtime center community member Frances Kamm and is named in honor of her parents. Frances was a bright philosophical light at the center for 15 years, and she and I co-taught the graduate fellowship for many years, a highlight of my time at Harvard. She profoundly shaped the fields of bioethics, moral philosophy, and continues to be a wonderful friend of the Center for Ethics. Frances is in the front row of our virtual audience right now, but asked me to read the following statement about the lecture and her parents. Mala Schussel and Soloman Kamm were victimized by the Nazis in Poland's Tarnow ghetto, the Auschwitz concentration camp, and then on the death march from Poland to Germany. Their memories were always vivid of the trampling of rights, the cruelty, and the failure to aid those in need that they experienced and they witnessed. Therefore, although they were not philosophers, but rather an artist and a designer, they had a deep concern with ethical issues, especially related to human rights. These lectures are devoted to their memory and are intended to promote philosophical inquiry into these issues they cared so deeply about. Frances continues, philosophy is a particular way of approaching ethical issues. It focuses on reasoning, logical argumentation, and critical thinking. It seeks truly normative conclusions, that is, conclusions about what should be done and not done and why, rather than empirical descriptions of people's beliefs about these matters. This approach is essential because we all need to make up our minds about these important issues. The Mala and Soloman Kamm lectures are intended to provide the deeper understanding that we need in order to do this. And I can't imagine a Kamm lecture who better fits this ideal than Professor Susan Wolf, who began her career teaching here at Harvard and is the Edma Corey Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Almost 3 decades ago, I stepped into my first public philosophy lecture with no clue what to expect. Professor Wolf took the podium with her wholly distinctive philosophical voice, a wry conversational tone that invited reflection over resolution. She poked at moral saints, suggesting that a life that pure might skip over laughs or a lazy afternoon. I was captivated and green enough to assume that every philosopher would lecture with that same verve and force. They don't. And that day I felt like she was speaking just to me, and having read her since, I felt that same way every time I read her work. Her classic works, Freedom with Reason, Meaning in Life, are rooted in the crookedness of our timber. Professor Wolf takes us as we come, flawed and feeling, exposing tensions that we often don't notice, even though they're right in front of our eyes. Morality versus goods like love, beauty, personal projects, even joy, freedom versus necessity. Professor Wolf nudges us to weigh these competing poles rather than to tidy them up, like her fitting fulfillment view most recently, where passion meets worthiness, and that lands with a firm, open grace. Tonight, at the Soffer Center's Mala and Soloman Kamm lecture, she will speak on responsibility and punishability. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wolf.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that beautiful introduction, and before that, for the invitation to speak here. I also want to thank Frances Kamm for creating this lecture. I've known Frances since more or less the beginning of my career, and have admired and learned from her work and valued her friendship throughout all that time. Also, throughout all that time, I've known of her love and admiration for her parents, so I'm especially honored to be giving a lecture dedicated to their memory. Finally, thank you all for being here and coming to hear this. What does it mean to say of someone that she is responsible? In contexts outside of academic philosophy, a common answer would be to say that someone is responsible. To say that someone is responsible is roughly synonymous with saying that she is reliable and trustworthy. When I write a job recommendation for a student, I will frequently mention this, assuming it's true, for it will usually be important to a potential employer that the candidate can be counted on to fulfill the duties, expectations, or, as it is often put, the responsibilities associated with the job. To be responsible in this sense is to possess a virtue, or at least a virtue-like trait. But academic philosophers who work on or teach the topic of responsibility are typically interested in something else. Specifically, they're interested in the status of an individual as an agent, a status that is evaluatively neutral. It is only in virtue of having this status, the philosopher might say, that a person is so much as capable of being responsible in the virtue sense, but they might add, it is also in virtue of their having this status that they can be irresponsible. Some of my students are more responsible than others, but my cat, my computer, or for that matter, my 2-year-old granddaughter are not even on the spectrum of virtue. They are neither responsible nor irresponsible. Though one might cash out the status that is of interest, as I have just done, as a status that grounds the capacity to possess virtues and vices of a certain kind, this would be controversial. In any case, a more common way philosophers think about the kind of responsibility they are interested in is in terms of the capacity to deserve praise and blame, or alternatively, reward and punishment. To be a responsible being, it is frequently said, is to be the kind of being who can be praiseworthy or blameworthy, the kind of being who can deserve blame or punishment if what they do is bad or wrong, and who can deserve praise or reward if what they do is good or right. We can illustrate what we have in mind, again, by contrasting the range of adult human beings of roughly normal intelligence and mental health with other sorts of individuals, including cats, 2-year-olds, and computers. Conceiving of responsibility, as philosophers do, as the status in virtue of which one can deserve blame, praise, punishment, and reward, it makes sense that philosophers should investigate the concept and explore the conditions of its application by considering a range of actions and asking whether and under what conditions we would regard the agent as responsible for them. A kills B, for example, but perhaps A didn't mean to. He thought the gun was a water pistol, or that he was giving B medicine rather than poison. Perhaps A was just a child, or a schizophrenic hearing voices urging him to kill B. Perhaps A was coerced or brainwashed, or there was a nefarious neurosurgeon waiting in the wings to fiddle with A's brain if A started to waver in his murderous intentions. Reflecting on one's intuitions about these and other examples and trying to explain them leads philosophers to various hypotheses about the conditions of responsibility. We may note in passing that this way of thinking about responsibility, a standard way in academic philosophy, is backward-looking. An act is performed, at time t, as we say. The question of whether the agent is responsible for that act is identified with the question of whether the agent's performance of the act makes it appropriate to respond by blaming or punishing, or alternatively praising or rewarding the agent, in cases where the act is respectively wrong and bad, or right and good. One looks back at the act, and perhaps at events leading up to and causing the act, to determine whether to blame, punish, and so on. By contrast, the layperson's sense of responsibility as a virtue-like trait is forward-looking. To be responsible in this sense is to be one whom one can expect to behave in certain ways going forward. It does not matter to the employer what has made the job candidate responsible, whether it was her upbringing, her genes, or her military training. What the employer wants is a prediction of how the candidate will do on the job. I will return to this point much later in the lecture, but for now I want to stay focused on the standard academic approach to the topic of responsibility, according to which responsibility is conceived as the status in virtue of which a person can be deserving of praise and blame, reward and punishment, and which takes the conditions of responsibility to depend on the state of the person at the moment of action and possibly the events leading up to it. As I've said, the question of responsibility on this approach is identified as fundamentally connected to the question of whether the kind of agency involved is such as to merit punishment or blame, reward or praise. It is almost universally assumed that the same kind of agency, meeting the same set of conditions, is needed, whether the response we are interested in is praise or blame, reward or punishment. But lately, I have come to think that this assumption is mistaken. Focusing for now on just the set of responses one may have to bad, wrongful, or otherwise objectionable behavior, I believe that the kind of responsibility we need to justify punishment is either too shallow or too deep to be identified with the kind of responsibility that make attitudes of blame appropriate. I will discuss two different conceptions of responsibility that might be offered as necessary for the justification of punishment, which I will call the institutional conception and the pure retribution conception. In contrast to both of these, we can call the kind of responsibility that makes attitudes of blame appropriate interpersonal responsibility. Separating the question of what is needed for interpersonal responsibility from the question of what is needed to justify punishment will, I think, suggest that the conditions of interpersonal responsibility are respectively stronger and weaker than those of the institutional and pure retribution conceptions, and will highlight something distinctively important about ourselves that has often been either mischaracterized or neglected. Further, reflecting separately on what interests we have in interpersonal responsibility and what interests we have in the justifiability of punishment, we may come to think about our negative reactive attitudes and the activities that express and respond to them differently from the ways we are used to, at least in academic philosophy. Before explaining these cryptic remarks, let me say a bit more about the distinction between punishment and what I mean by attitudes of blame. My sense of this distinction originates in the philosopher P.F. Strawson's discussion of these matters in his seminal article, Freedom and Resentment. In that essay, Strawson pointed out that traditionally discussions of freedom and responsibility focused on questions of what was necessary to justify punishment and reward, moral condemnation and approval, noting that these practices and judgments admit, where they do not imply, a certain detachment from the actions or agents which are their objects. Strawson invites us to consider instead the non-detached attitudes and reactions of people directly involved in transactions with each other, the attitudes and reactions of offended parties and beneficiaries, including such things as gratitude, resentment, forgiveness, love, and hurt feelings. By focusing on such things, Strawson hopes to remind us what it is actually like to be involved in ordinary interpersonal relationships, and to call our attention to the kind of importance we attach to the attitudes and intentions towards us of those who stand in these relationships to us, as well as to the kinds of reactive attitudes and feelings to which we ourselves are prone. He then draws a contrast between the attitude or range of attitudes of involvement and participation in a human relationship on the one hand, and what might be called the objective attitude or range of attitudes to another human being on the other. And here I hope you'll forgive me for including now a very long quotation from Strawson. To adopt the objective attitude to another human being is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as a subject for what, in a wide range of sense, might be called treatment, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, though not all kinds of love. It cannot include the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you may fight with him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or to reason with him. In shifting our attention away from questions about the justification of punishment and reward to questions about the aptness of reactive attitudes like resentment, indignation, and gratitude, Strawson did not, I think, mean to change the subject, but rather to see the subject in a new and better light. He does not suggest that there are two, or much less more, kinds of moral responsibility, but rather seems to assume that there is one kind, but that we can get a better grip on it if we focus not on the question of what justifies reward and punishment, approval and condemnation, but on the aptness of attitudes beside and beneath these responses that often animate our interest in a deeper way. Be that as it may, my understanding of the attitudes of blame is precisely that of the range of reactive attitudes Strawson talks about that arise in response to behavior that we also disapprove of. The literature has focused especially on attitudes of anger, resentment, and indignation, though later in the talk I shall suggest a more expansive set. For now, however, let us return to punishment and to the idea or ideas of responsibility that come out of an identification of responsibility with a status in virtue of which one can be said to deserve punishment or reward. One plausible conception identifies responsibility with rational agency. That is, with the ability to recognize norms and to govern one's actions in accordance with them. Thus, for example, consider someone who commits a fraud, perhaps an internet scam that cheats hundreds of naive people out of considerable sums of money. Such behavior is clearly wrong and rightly illegal, so it is plausible to think that so long as the scammer can reasonably have been expected to know that it is wrong, to know that a significant penalty would be imposed if he is caught, and to have abstained from committing the scam in the first place if he wanted to, it seems fair and appropriate to punish him. I call this the institutional conception of responsibility because it reflects at least one common idea of what is needed to justify punishment in the context of institutions, where norms and the penalties that would be imposed if they are violated tend to be codified, or at least publicly known to those who fall under the institution's authority. The legal system is the most obvious example where punishment plays a significant role, but many other institutions, clubs, universities, licensing organizations, places of employment, also have norms such that members of the institution may fairly be punished if these norms are violated. This might seem at first like an adequate basis for justifying reactive attitudes of blame, too. After all, the conditions of rational agency needed to qualify as responsible, according to the institutional conception, do separate normal adult human beings from cats, present-day computers, and 2-year-olds, and we may well be indignant toward the perpetrator of the internet scam. However, among the individuals who qualify as responsible on this model, individuals who could be justifiably punished according to this conception are psychopaths as well as corporations. It seems to me reasonable that this should be so if, for example, a psychopath or corporation knew that they would suffer a penalty if they were caught violating a law, but decided to take the risk anyway. Why should they not be punished when their wrongful behavior is detected? They knew what they were risking. Yet it seems to me inappropriate to hold reactive attitudes towards psychopaths and corporations, for, at least as I understand them, they lack the psychological faculties needed to understand and appreciate the moral reasons for obeying the law. We should regard psychopaths with what Strawson termed the objective attitude, even though they may be fairly punished according to the institutional conception of responsibility. The fact that this conception would justify punishment of psychopaths, corporations, and other constitutionally amoral agents explains why I said earlier that the conditions of interpersonal responsibility were stronger than this. And many, if not most, philosophers interested in what they would call moral responsibility would agree that institutional responsibility, as I have explained it, is too shallow to constitute moral responsibility. Although the institutional conception can explain why it is not unfair to hold amoral agents accountable for following rules that they can choose to obey or not, the justification for punishing them when they violate the rules is too pragmatic and instrumental to give these philosophers what they are looking for. Specifically, it is insufficient to ground the idea that the wrongdoer simply deserves punishment as a direct response to their having acted wrongly and independently of any pragmatic considerations. As Strawson himself pointed out, the idea of desert, to which I just alluded, can be somewhat mysterious, but it appears to be at the heart of a retributive conception of punishment. The idea is that it is fitting in itself for wrongdoers to suffer, and thus that there is something preferable about a world in which morally responsible wrongdoers are punished proportionally to their wrongs, as compared to a world in which they do not suffer for their crimes. All of us who have grown up in the West will, I suspect, be somewhat familiar with this idea. It is the negative half of the idea of divine justice that has its roots in Judeo-Christian thought, if not earlier. But the idea also survives in more secular frameworks, which might appeal to the metaphor of a person's moral record. The thought would be that wrongdoing goes on one's imaginary or metaphorical moral record, and there is something fitting, and therefore good or right, in the matching of moral turpitude and virtue with suffering and reward, respectively. I confess that for me, spelling out the idea of pure retribution does not make it any less mysterious. Although I can understand and even sometimes sympathize with someone who withdraws goodwill toward a serious wrongdoer, and even someone who wants and takes pleasure in the suffering of a person who has seriously wronged her, I cannot understand how such suffering can be good in itself. That we would enjoy their suffering does not make it a good thing, nor does there seem any basis in thinking that our enjoying it is a reflection of some independent fact of its being a good thing. And since I cannot understand it, I do not know how to think about what it would take for a person to be responsible in a sense that would justify pure retribution. Still, many philosophers seem to think that if there is such a thing as moral responsibility, this is what it would imply. And many of those who hold this view believe that moral responsibility requires a kind of freedom and control that is incompatible with determinism. Some of these, concluding that there is no such freedom and control, conclude that there is no such thing as moral responsibility. Others, unwilling to reject moral responsibility, conclude that such contra-causal freedom is available to us. It is because of the connection typically made between the pure retribution conception of responsibility and a belief in incompatibilism that I have said that this conception is too deep to be identified with what is necessary to make reactive attitudes of blame appropriate. But it's more important to me to point out that the pure retribution conception seems completely unrelated to the appropriateness of reactive attitudes, including the reactive, luckily it was closed, including the reactive attitudes of blame that include anger, resentment, and indignation. To see this, return to the examples of individuals who, according to the institutional model, can justifiably be punished, but who do not seem, to philosophers of responsibility like me, to be truly responsible. As I said earlier, it seems to me inappropriate to hold reactive attitudes towards psychopaths and corporations. For at least as I understand them, they lack the psychological faculties needed to understand and appreciate the moral reasons for obeying the law or for behaving morally more generally. Even though psychopaths can be given instrumental reasons not to lie, cheat, steal, murder, etc., they cannot understand or appreciate moral reasons. Because they lack some faculty or faculties, including empathy at least, they just don't and can't get why they should have any non-instrumental concern or respect for others. And so we should take the objective attitude, in Strawson's sense, toward the psychopath, just as we would or should towards a tiger or grizzly bear, even though, unlike the tiger or grizzly bear, the psychopath can be fairly subject to punishment on the institutional conception. To elaborate, when a psychopath, or perhaps an extraterrestrial alien or corporation, behaves in a way that displays their indifference or malevolence to me, I may be frustrated and annoyed, but not insulted or emotionally hurt, any more than I am about the tiger or grizzly bear. I don't take it personally because I realize that they couldn't possibly see or have any non-instrumental reason to care about me. By contrast, if a non-psychopathic human being displays indifference or malevolence, I am insulted or hurt, and may well get angry. I get angry because I want them to have the kind of concern and respect for me and for those I care about that I think they ought to have, given that they can understand that I am a person like them. And it's a kind of concern and respect that I am prepared to give to them. Recall Strawson's remark at the end of his characterization of the objective attitude that if your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you may fight with him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. This remark is so opaque and intriguing that it is surprising that it hasn't received more attention. What is the difference between fighting and quarreling? And isn't negotiation a kind of reasoning? My point about the psychopath, however, seems to me to suggest a way of understanding what he means. For although negotiation involves a narrow and instrumental kind of reasoning, which Strawson evidently takes to be compatible with regarding someone with a purely objective attitude, we engage in a broader, less formalizable kind of reasoning when we talk to each other about values and ends. Often such reasoning appeals not only to logic, but to empathy, sympathy, perceptiveness, and imagination. And while we can negotiate with a psychopath by giving him incentives for following the law, for example, there is no point trying to reason with him to have a heart or to treat others as we would want to be treated ourselves. It is the fact, or what I take to be a fact, that we can reason with others, that is, with most non-psychopathic human beings, for example, that makes it appropriate to take what Strawson calls the participant stance toward them, as opposed to the objective attitude. For this shared capacity, is this the right? For this shared capacity for understanding ourselves and each other as beings with reciprocal claims for respect and concern allows us to be part of an interpersonal moral community, as opposed to just a society of peacefully coexisting individuals, a community within which one can find friends and romantic partners, soulmates and interlocutors with whom to explore the world. It is with this community, I take it, that reactive attitudes are appropriate. To be interpersonally responsible, then, understanding that phrase as referring to the status in virtue of which the participant stance in which reactive attitudes have their home is appropriate, is at least roughly to be such as to be capable of the attitudes of respect and concern for others with similar capacities, and the capacity to govern one's behavior in light of them. What is needed in order to be capable of such attitudes of respect and concern, I believe, is an immensely difficult question, which philosophers of moral responsibility would do well to give more attention to. To say that the individual must be reasons responsive is certainly much too vague for psychopaths and corporations, and for that matter, tigers and grizzly bears are in some sense reasons responsive. But even without being able to say more about this, we can see that interpersonal responsibility has no particular connection to the justifiability of pure retribution. It's being appropriate to resent someone who has treated you disrespectfully or callously neither depends on nor implies that it would be good in itself or fitting from the point of view of the universe for that person to suffer some harm, nor would it imply that one has a basis for the judgment that punishment would be reasonable or fair. And so interpersonal responsibility need not be concerned with the question of whether one can be responsible in the sense that the justifiability of pure retribution would require. For that matter, interpersonal responsibility's connection to institutional responsibility is also loose at best. We've already seen that an individual, like a psychopath or a corporation, may be justly punished on the institutional conception, even if they are not interpersonally responsible at all. We might also note that the relation between what punishment a person who is interpersonally responsible deserves and the reactive attitudes we are inclined to have towards them is neither obvious nor direct. Recently, I watched a television show in which, over the course of the season, a kidnapping went terribly wrong. Oh, I see. I'm looking at the wrong pages here. 4 men were involved in the kidnapping, each with different characters who became involved for different reasons. One was weak, another was foolish, a third was callous, and a fourth positively malevolent. At least 2 of them, and probably 3, would never have participated in the scheme if they had expected such severe harm to ensue. And one, once he saw the turn things had taken, even helped the kidnapping victim escape at great foreseeable cost to himself. My reactive attitudes, as I assume the reactive attitudes of other viewers, varied accordingly, ranging from pity to enraged indignation. Still, kidnapping is an extremely serious crime. All these men entered into the scheme voluntarily, and whether or not they did know, they all could have been reasonably expected to know that the risk of great harm to others was inherent in their scheme. These considerations make harsh punishment for the crime appropriate, I believe, for all of them. Even if we think that the one who helped the victim escape should get a reduced sentence in recognition of his belated effort to undo what he had begun, the variation in punishment deserved does not reflect a proportional variation in reactive blame. Somewhat closer to home and to the non-fictional world, we might consider my experience with students who plagiarize. I'm not very good at spotting or proving plagiarism from my students, but when I used to teach large lecture courses whose papers were graded by teaching assistants, a plagiarized paper would occasionally be detected. The TA would come to me with it, I would review the work and call the student in to explain why, in accordance with the policy that was explicitly laid out in the syllabus, they would be getting a 0 on the paper, which usually meant a failure in the course, and a black mark on their transcript. Upon discovering that a student had plagiarized a paper for my class, I would initially be indignant. How dare they try to get away with cheating? How dare they try to pull something over on me and my TA? What a lack of moral integrity. But almost invariably, when the student showed up at my office, I would find that the student was not the entitled, lazy, and cynical teenager I had imagined. They were struggling and scared, lacking confidence in their ability to write an acceptable paper on their own, and too ashamed and shy to come to office hours to ask for help. Once I saw the student and understand why they had cheated, my indignation vanished. But this seemed to me to provide no reason for withdrawing or lessening the penalty. After all, plagiarism is unacceptable, and the policy was well publicized in advance. Under the circumstances, there is nothing unfair about holding a student responsible for their decision. Indeed, it would be unfair not to hold the student responsible, given that most of their classmates were conscientiously abiding by the rules, and that the advertised standards would apply to other plagiarizing students. The justification of punishment, then, need not, and I am inclined to think should not, be primarily a reflection of reactive attitudes of anger, resentment, or indignation, nor should the degree of punishment vary proportionally to the degree of such attitudes. As important as it is to notice that just punishment need not correspond to a related degree of angry, blaming emotions, we should also notice that as often as not, such angry, blaming emotions are evoked by behavior we would not think of punishing at all, at least if we follow Strawson in understanding these emotions and attitudes as reactions to a perception that the person we are reacting to has not shown us an acceptable level of goodwill, respect, or concern. When someone treats us in a patronizing way, or cuts in front of us in traffic, or makes a joke at our expense, we may get angry and even express it by calling them out or honking our horn. But the idea of imposing a sanction, even a very small one for a small offense, seems out of place. The reason for this, I think, is that our interest in practices of punishment overlap with, but do not fully coincide with our interest in regarding each other with the participant stance. In order for society to run smoothly, we need people to refrain from killing each other, cheating each other, and stealing each other's property. Universities need people to refrain from plagiarizing. Medical licensing boards need people not to perform surgery while drunk, and so on. We would need these things even if we were a society of psychopaths or of pure egoists, And we need practices that will deter people from killing, cheating, and so on, that apply to the psychopaths and egoists among us, even in a society in which most of us are non-psychopathic and non-egoistic. Practices that hold people accountable for behaving in accordance with norms like do not kill, do not steal, and so on. Practices that assign sanctions, that is, punishments, to those who violate the relevant norms are set up to fill these needs. The institutional conception of responsibility is well suited for use in these practices. It supplies conditions under which such practices can fairly be invoked and applied. Our interest in living in a community in which people have reciprocal concern and respect for each other goes beyond this, however. Social beings that we are, we want not only to live in peaceful coexistence and cooperations with others on whom we rely, we want also to be respected and cared about by those who are capable of respecting and caring about us, that is. To live in a society in which people in general have a certain degree of respect and concern for each other improves, I would say vastly improves, the quality of our lives. And as I said earlier, it is only within such a community that one can find friends and romantic partners, soulmates and interlocutors with whom to explore the world. The community within which it makes sense to have these interests and to look for these relationships is, of course, the community toward whom we can appropriately take the participant stance. In the vocabulary that I have introduced, we can characterize it as a community of interpersonally responsible beings. Much as we want people to respect and care about us, though, it does not make much sense to hold them accountable for doing so, in a sense that would make it reasonable to punish them if they fail to comply. We cannot make people have the attitudes we want them to have, or even the attitudes we think they ought to have, by threatening them. Respect us or else. And in any case, our interest is fundamentally present and forward-looking. We want people to respect and care about us now, and for these attitudes to extend into the future. If at a particular moment, time t as it were, they do not respect or care about us, we may get angry and call them out. This may be unpleasant for them, but it is not punishment, it is heated conversation. Of course, failures of respect or concern often express themselves in actions that violate the sorts of norms for which we do hold people accountable, and conversely, violations of these norms often reflect a lack of respect or concern for their victims. Furthermore, we tend to assume that such actions reflect a lack of respect and concern, even when we don't have anything but the behavior itself to go on, as I assumed with my plagiarizing students. In such cases, our reactive attitudes and our inclinations to hold the violators accountable and punishable arise together. We do not distinguish our judgment that they ought to be punished from our judgment that reactive attitudes of blame are warranted. We do not distinguish attitudes that carry the thought that punishment is deserved from attitudes of anger, resentment, and indignation that are responses to the impression that the target of such attitudes has failed to show us an adequate degree of respect and concern. We assume that the individuals involved not only meet the standards of responsibility required by the institutional conception of punishment, but that they also meet the standards necessary for the appropriateness of the participant stance. That is, we assume that the individuals involved are both punishable and interpersonally responsible. Or at least, we would assume this if we realized that punishability and interpersonal responsibility were distinct. The wrongdoers are frequently both accountable for their wrongful behavior in a sense that would justify punishment, and blameworthy for it in the sense that makes them appropriate targets of negative reactive attitudes. I've argued that these two designations can also come apart. Psychopaths may be accountable for their wrongs even when they are not interpersonally responsible, and negative reactive attitudes towards people may be appropriate even when there is no wrong for which they are, strictly speaking, accountable. Once we distinguish punishability from interpersonal responsibility, and correspondingly distinguish what people are accountable for from what constitute objectionable failures of respect and concern, I believe we can make better sense of a wider swath of our experience than we can if we insist on keeping punishability and interpersonal responsibility together. The philosophical literature on responsibility and blame, for example, has tended to assume that when someone acts wrongly in ways for which they are punishable, the appropriate and natural reactive attitudes to have, if one has any at all, are all varieties of anger, resentment, or indignation. But at least in my social world, it seems to me that most people have concern and respect for others to an acceptable degree. When they act badly or wrongly, it is not because they are indifferent to others, much less malevolent. It is rather that we, are weak, careless, ignorant, insensitive, fearful, preoccupied, and so on. I may blame them in the sense of holding them accountable and punishable for acting badly, but I am unlikely to resent them or feel indignation unless, in response to their displays of bad behavior, they get defensive and refuse to acknowledge that they can and should do better. Further, once one separates interpersonal responsibility from punishability, one can notice that the range of negative reactive attitudes we are liable to have towards ourselves and each other, as well as the range of ways we express them, are much wider than the blaming attitudes of anger, resentment, and indignation that philosophers of responsibility have tended to focus on. I react negatively to people who are obnoxious, arrogant, creepy, petty, lazy, cowardly, and self-centered. If they act wrongly as a result of these traits, I may blame them for that. But obnoxious behavior or an arrogant demeanor is often not so much wrong as distasteful. Even if there is nothing about it that deserves blame or warrants punishment, it is not inappropriate to criticize it, at least silently to myself, in a way that may involve reactive disapproval and moral disgust. And of course, there's also a whole range of admiring reactive attitudes one has towards people who are exceptionally kind, courageous, generous, insightful, and so on. What grounds the attribution of interpersonal responsibility, I think, is the capacity to understand and appreciate the reasons others in the interpersonal community have, and the reasons we and they should have for valuing some things and disvaluing others, in the thick sense of reason that allows us to reason with and not just negotiate with non-psychopathic others. Of course, to have the capacity to understand and appreciate reasons is one thing. To actually understand and appreciate them is another. And indeed, to understand and appreciate all the reasons others have and the reasons we and they should have is a never-ending, incompletable task. It is not completely or even primarily under one's own control. The process of coming to understand and appreciate reasons or values one did not have before can be difficult, slow, and somewhat mysterious, as is the process of bringing one's behavior into line with new reasons and values when breaking entrenched patterns and habits are involved. This is at least part of the reason why it seems to me important to notice that what justifies punishment, and blame insofar as one connects blame to the judgment that one is deserving of punishment, and what makes reactive attitudes appropriate are different. Let me illustrate by considering a case of a more or less inveterate sexist. He applies double standards in his judgments of men's and women's characters. He's much less likely to take women's ideas seriously than men's, and he's frequently amused by incidents that one finds appalling. At the same time, let us suppose that he was brought up in a community where sexist attitudes were nearly universally accepted, shaping his continuing perception in ways he is not even aware of. In such a case, it seems to me plausible to assume that the man has the capacity to see women differently, and so to understand and appreciate reasons for not being sexist. But whether he can be reasonably expected to have done so at the time that we encounter him, or indeed at any time in the future, is another question. If we are interested in whether it would be justifiable to punish him for his sexist attitudes, it seems to me the answer is no. If he could not have been reasonably expected to have known better and done better than to be a sexist, it is unfair to punish him for the bad attitudes he has on either the institutional or pure retribution conception. And yet these attitudes are bad, and it is appropriate to disapprove of them and to be critical of him for having them. If you consider it worth your while, perhaps he's a relative or a colleague, you may even try to reason with him in a heated or non-heated way to try to show him how and why his attitudes are objectionable. After all, as a member of your interpersonal community, you want him to have the right kind of respect and concern for others and to express these in his behavior. If we do not distinguish interpersonal responsibility from the kinds of responsibility relevant to the justification of punishment, we will have a hard time reconciling the judgment that he does not deserve punishment with the judgment that he does deserve criticism. We will feel pressure to think either that because it would be unjustifiable to punish him, we should not have a negative reactive response to him, or that because we are appropriately disgusted by his sexism, it would also be appropriate and justifiable to punish him. In other words, we feel pressure to think that the sexist is either completely off the hook of our censure for his sexist views, or on the hook and so deserving of sanction. Of course, if his sexism has led him to violate explicit and reasonable institutional norms, norms forbidding sexual harassment, for example, then he may be subject to punishment, just as a psychopath can be punished for committing fraud. He does not have to understand why behavior that is explicitly forbidden is wrong, to be held to the rules that he knows apply to him and to which he is capable of conforming. But as to his sexist attitudes themselves, and the behavioral manifestations of it that do not fall under articulated standards, it seems to me that although punitive responses are neither justified nor likely to be effective, criticism would be entirely appropriate and at least possibly effective. My discussion of the sexist places weight on the difference between a person's having the capacity to understand and appreciate what is good and right, and it's being reasonable to expect them to have done this at any particular time. The former, I have argued, is necessary for interpersonal responsibility. The latter is necessary for whatever kind of responsibility would justify punishment. Because we rarely recognize the distinction between these two sorts of responsibility, we often treat these two conditions as the same. We say he couldn't have done otherwise, perhaps as shorthand for the more cumbersome he couldn't have been reasonably expected to do otherwise, because either would serve equally well to explain why punishment, and blame if it is understood to legitimate punishment, would be unfair. But if our interest is not in punishment or punishment justifying judgments and attitudes, but in relating to another person with the participant stance, these two conditions cannot be elided. My discussion of the sexist has assumed that the sexist is someone other than ourselves, someone whom we are offended or angered or annoyed by, and whom we are inclined to respond to reactively. Distinguishing interpersonal responsibility from punishment justifying responsibility, I have argued, allows us to recognize a wider range of negative reactions to the sexist than our standard conceptual dichotomy seems to permit. We do not have to choose between regarding the sexist as punishable for his sexism or excused for his sexism, or alternatively as a hopeless case to be written off, qua his sexism at least, by taking a purely objective attitude toward him. Indeed, once we realize that other options, other varieties of interpersonal and reactive criticism, we might say, are available to us, I would argue that we should take wide advantage of them, reducing our interest in punishment and punishability accordingly. But it is also important to apply the lessons of separating interpersonal responsibility from punishment justifying responsibility to ourselves. We observed of the sexist that although he could not reasonably have been expected to have overcome his sexism at time t, he is capable of overcoming it and so appropriately subject to criticism for it. But, to paraphrase Flaubert, the sexist, c'est moi. We all have the capacity to understand and appreciate things that we do not yet appreciate, and which we cannot reasonably have been expected to appreciate by now. We all have the capacity to do better and be better than we are now. Regarding oneself as an interpersonally responsible agent, then, commits one to recognizing that one has the capacity for self-improvement, both in understanding what respect and concern for others involves and behaving in accordance with that. These capacities outrun the range of attitudes and behavior that one can reasonably be expected to have already acquired. They outrun, in other words, the range of attitudes and behavior for which we are punishable. In a companion lecture to this one, titled Humble Apologies, I discussed the practice of apologizing and the dominant conception that apologies are fitting when and only when one has done something for which one can be justly blamed or punished. Insofar as apologies are understood to fall within the domain of interpersonal responsibility, however, the remarks of this lecture suggest a framework that de-emphasizes judgments of culpability, punishability, and blame, insofar as blameworthiness is associated with punishability. It encourages us to develop habits according to which we will respond to our own actions as well as others with less interest in the question of whether we or they deserve sanctions for what has been done, and more interest in the question of whether we or they will have and show an acceptable level of respect and concern for others going forward. And just as when we are offended or harmed, we want the offender to recognize and regret that they have offended or harmed us, when we are the offenders, we may, and I am inclined to think we should, want to assure those whom we have hurt that we want to be good faith participants in an interpersonal community with them. In other words, we should be freer and quicker to apologize than many of us currently are. Of course, there is no guarantee that a person who feels offended or wronged by another and who blames or criticizes them will be reasonable in reacting that way, any more than there is a guarantee that a person who is rightly blamed or criticized will accept these judgments. There may not be a meeting of minds about the description or evaluation of what has happened. But if the parties involved are interpersonally responsible, if they are participants in a shared moral community, it will at least be an opportunity for them to reason with and not just negotiate with each other, with the chance that they will come to understand and appreciate the episode in the same way. Some time ago, when I was beginning to work on these lectures, I heard a lecture by Miranda Fricker called The Art of Blaming and Forgiving. The point of the title was in part to suggest that blaming and forgiving are arts, as opposed to practices that can be codified in rules, and that they are in turn part of the art of living. Since I was working on my lecture on apologies at the time, I naturally found myself wanting to extend the idea. After all, apologizing is the flip side of blaming and forgiving, and my views about when to apologize fit very well with Fricker's views on blame and forgiveness. In my lecture on apologies, I argue that apologizing should not be understood as apt only when one's act is, strictly speaking, wrong or blameworthy. But I do not and cannot give an alternative set of rules that will determine when an apology is appropriate. Learning how to apologize well, at the right time, in the right way, to the right people, and so on, may well be like learning other skills that we are inclined to describe as arts. In agreement with Fricker, I want to say that forgiving, apologizing, and blaming, insofar as these practices are not necessarily connected to punishability, are all parts of the art of living. More precisely, according to the ideas in this paper, they are parts of the art of living with other people as interpersonally responsible members of a shared community.
Thank you, Professor Wolf, for a marvelous lecture that embodied the art of living that you describe. There's only one twist. I'll keep the cue. We have a hard stop at 5:45, and there are interpersonal responsibility conditions that would be triggered and maybe mild punishability if we go beyond that. So if you could be extra economical in your questions, I'd be grateful.
Two brief questions. First is, notice that question in terms of interpersonal. Even when, so the question is discussed in the interpersonal context, even when the self is concerned, you talk about apology, which is interpersonal, rather than something like conscience and feeling guilty when that is warranted. Now, I'd love to hear why you comment on whether you think this is a choice of direction or there are reasons to sort of treat these cases very differently. And the second question is just in light of your work on supererogation. So in the end, you kind of distinguish criticism and blame based on whether it's reasonable to expect such behavior. But it seems like there is yet a further distinction from sort of things that one is capable of doing. That doesn't mean sort of so supererogation seems to be a separate category even from the capability part, right? Sorry, I'm not being articulate, but trying to map onto if that makes sense.
So
the last one didn't make sense.
No, I think it does make sense. I'm just trying to now remember, you had two questions, and the first one was,
conscience. Why
am I saying interpersonal rather than conscience? I guess, I haven't thought about this question before, and I try to keep my answers short. But I think it's because the idea of responsibility in the first place, I think, arises only because we live in a community in which we want to respond to each other and behave and have attitudes towards each other of a certain kind. We internalize a lot of the values and norms, and so having internalized them, we can then think about these things and feel these things by ourselves and towards ourselves. So, but I guess I think that that comes second. As to the other question about supererogation, one of the themes of this lecture that I kind of got emphasized more at the end is that I think we would do well to focus less on, is it wrong or just kind of shady? Is it, obligatory or just good? And so a lot of those things, when we do focus on those lines, will turn out to be supererogatory rather than obligatory. But I think my point in a lot of this is to say, not that I'm denying that distinction exists, but that the importance of that distinction should be minimized.
Thanks so much, Susan. There's an ambiguity in my mind. I was going to ask you to resolve it for me. In the middle of the talk, you kind of contrasted two different aims. Sort of the aim of holding people responsible in the institutional sense is to get them to behave well. And, our aims in having these interpersonal reactive attitudes have to do with care and respect. So that sounds like, okay, different aims, different functions, different purposes. More towards the end of the talk, when you were talking about why we can't punish the sexist, it sounded more like we can't really expect him to recognize and respond to act in a certain way, even though he has the capacity that outstrips that. He has a capacity to understand these reasons. So that would suggest that that there's a more and less perfectionist standard going on here, and that the interpersonal is the more perfectionist standard or the kind of higher standard. And the legalistic is what we settle for when, we have to, accept our imperfections. And I wanted to know, which is it? It's sort of about right and virtue, right? Are there different domains here and different functions and different interests that get served? Or do we have law because we're not perfect and lamentably we sometimes, need to set lower standards just to accommodate our imperfections?
Again, a really interesting question. I have not thought about it. I didn't think of, not just law, but moral obligations are things, there might be an informal kind of punishability in non-legal ways, but I wasn't thinking of those as things we are settling for. Well, but perhaps the reason for that has to do with other parts of my view about moral and non-moral values, and I'm a pluralist about ways people can live good lives, and some of them are more morally high-toned than others. I don't think of it as settling because I don't think everybody ought to behave the same way if only, they were willing or something. So I guess I want to keep it at, we have obligations that we need to enforce or inculcate in order to live peacefully with each other. Mm-hmm. But there are other things that we want beyond living peacefully with each other that involve a deeper kind of human connection.
Thanks.
I got it. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for a deep and fascinating lecture. I am curious about whether we should distinguish desert of reward from the fittingness of praise in the same way you've distinguished desert of punishment from the fittingness of blame, or in a different way. I see some similarities, also some reasons to expect the story to be different. Of course, Susan Wolfe has famously argued there's a big asymmetry between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, namely that the latter requires the ability to do otherwise and the former doesn't. That was a while ago. I'm not sure you still think that. But anyway, in this lecture, you suggested that we ultimately care about punishment because we need people to refrain from certain kinds of behavior. We want to shape their behavior in ways that meets our needs, and we would need that even if we were a society of psychopaths. And so we punish just to kind of deter people from the kind of like the behaviors such that if they were performed, then the kind of basic fabric of the social institutions would crumble and stuff wouldn't work out. Mm-hmm. And it's noteworthy that we don't reward people just for behaving in the minimal way, like just for not plagiarizing, We reward people typically for doing stuff that goes above and beyond in certain ways. It's closer to the concept of the supererogatory. So that I think suggests that deserving reward might be closer to being a fitting target of praise than deserving punishment is to being a fitting target of blame. What do you think?
I'm not sure what I think, but my first thought is, do we reward people for being wonderful? We praise them. I would say that's when we praise them.
What do we reward people for? That's the first question.
I wouldn't have thought that was reward. The paradigmatic cases of reward are $100 if you find my lost dog, or here's the gold medal for being the first one over the finish line. Yeah. Those are for actions, not for attitudes. And in that sense, there's a kind of, they're closer to punishment than praise. So I do think there's a difference between reward and praise. I don't know to what extent they're parallel to the difference between punishment and blaming attitudes, but when it comes to the positive end of things, except in these, who's the winner of the race or who's, I think praise is much. We think of praise in terms of attitudes, and it's much more interpersonal all the way down, I think.
Yes. Thanks for the lecture. Yeah, thank you for the lecture. My question regards, I guess, the institutional conception of punishment, mm-hmm. and I guess the sense in which such punishment can be said to be appropriate, right? So the idea is that, if somebody is rational, they know that certain norms apply to them, they know that, there's a consequence for violating, they can reasonably be expected to avoid, etc., etc., but they still go ahead and violate the norm, then the punishment is appropriate. I'm wondering in what sense, we should say that the punishment is appropriate or that they deserve punishment, as opposed to the punishment will kind of succeed in deterring them or something like that. And I guess one way of kind of framing this question is you can think of punishment in multiple ways. or the function of punishment in multiple ways. You might think punishment is like a form of payback. You've done something wrong, therefore you should pay the price. Or you might think it's like meant as a deterrent, as I mentioned earlier. It's like, if we punish you, then you're not going to, do this thing anymore. In the payback case, so first, in the deterrent case, if there's a way to deter somebody without punishing them, then you might think, punishment isn't, apt in any sense, other than like it's being, practical. And if there's a more practical way, then there's no point in punishing the person. But then the deterrent case, it seems like it requires you, in the payback case, it seems like it requires you to consent to like the institution or the norm or something, where it's like, you've bought into this, you've kind of broken the contract, therefore you owe something in response. But, if you're a psychopath, or if you're just somebody who just doesn't believe in the institution or the system of norms, then I'm not sure how that version applies. So if you could shed light on that.
Great, good. First of all, I should say, I abstracted from all the issues about punishment, like, is it appropriate to punish, how big a penalty, what kind of penalties? So I was sort of assuming, let's assume that there is a morally acceptable system of punishment as a system, something which is obviously counterfactual in the United States, but and my issue was just, is it fair with respect to the person's status as a responsible agent to, connect to that? So, and the claim was, it's fair if they knew, assuming that it's a just system of punishment, then it's fair as long as they knew what the norms were, could have avoided it, and, that then you can appropriately talk about that. I didn't think of it as payback. That sounds more like a retributive conception to me. But, right, there is a problem, which is, you might think it's not fair to punish a psychopath, even if the system of punishment would be just for non-psychopathics. But, if we think of punishment for me, it's easier to focus not on, when we think psychopath, we think, horrible, vicious murder, right, and horrible, vicious punishment, right? But just think of a psychopath who commits tax fraud, right? Like, why shouldn't they be punished just because they're psychopaths? That shouldn't make a difference, right? That is, if you think it's appropriate for there to be laws against tax fraud and so on, and that the punishment is suitable, that's sort of the way I want to think about it, and all the big problems that come when you take lots of other very real examples, I'm just bracketing out.
I'll make reports. Francis has a question.
I do. Francis has 2 questions for you. So let me sit so I can read these better. So first, Francis asks, you say that the psychopath has no reason to care for us. You seem to accept an internalist sense of having a reason, but you would also agree that there's a reason for him to be different from the way they are. In that sense, do you accept an externalist view of reasons?
I need her in front of me so I can talk. I don't recall saying that I thought they had a reason to be different from they are. I just think they don't have a reason to care about us any more than a tiger or a grizzly bear does.
Should I move on? Let me move on to the second part of this. Is a non-punishing reactive attitude compatible with something like a retributive attitude? For example, if a man has humiliated a woman by ogling at her, if someone does this to him and he feels humiliated, do we actually think it's a good thing in itself that this has happened to him?
Interesting question. I don't have a strong view on that, but I'll try to get one.
I guess I just wanted to follow up on the exchange you had of Zoe about the positive side of the ledger. because
about
the positive side of the ledger, like how,
Yeah.
because it wasn't obvious to me that some of the things you said about the reasonable expectations and how that bears on the fitness of punishment translate as plausibly for rewards.
Yeah.
Like it'd be weird, if you can't reasonably expect somebody to adjust their behavior, but they do, and they like do the thing, that you get the reward for. It seems like they merit the reward. It's like to say you don't merit the reward because it wasn't reasonable to expect you. It seems like the same argument that you ran for the sexist. So it doesn't seem like it works in the.
I agree. It does. I mean, that the distinction between couldn't do it and couldn't be expected to do it doesn't have any application in the positive case. I mean, that really, it's the sort of thing you worry about when you want to know whether someone is accountable for something. But accountability as a notion in general seems to me to be aimed at norms and their violations, not at what goes above the line, so to speak.
I am watching the clock, so I apologize if I'm curt, but it seems like based on and apologies if I misinterpret this, like the categories that have been set up, there's these easily definable and universally acceptable wrongs. And whether they're big or small, they can be kidnapping, as you mentioned, a murder, I think was mentioned earlier, and maybe even smaller things like littering, where they're definable, they're not acceptable. And then there's these things that are harder to define and maybe not as universally acceptable, like being sexist and without any actions that arise, maybe directly, and that are not violating these other more clear things. But that implies that there are these other two categories, which I feel like are almost defined by the punishments and the rules, where it's things like that are either harder to define but universally accepted, which is hard to make rigid by rules, but things that are not universally accepted but are defined by the rules, whether you can make a U-turn or all these other things that we agree on based on the rules we have set, but are absolutely not universal. And in these cases, these are things that are the rules and the punishments create. And so how do you feel about, I don't know if you and I know you touched on this a little, but how would you expand on that? And how would you say that the ability, the utility of punishment in creating these expectations now within a smaller society?
Good. All right, so first I want to just distinguish the issue of universality with the issue of kind of gray areas, which, what's the clear cases of punishment, they don't have to be universal across humanity. They just have to be kind of articulable formally or informally within the relevant community. But as you say, as morality evolves, or as our idea of what morality should be evolves, the content of our obligations, the content of the rules for which we can then become punishable have to change too. So there's this kind of transitional period, when maybe some people will say, here, these are the rules, and other people will say, no, those aren't the rules. And I did allude to this, very briefly, when morality is changing, when our views about morality are changing socially, there are going to be times when people just aren't going to see eye to eye about this. They won't see whether they've done anything wrong, or someone will say you've done something wrong. Someone will say, I don't think so. These are not. And that's the kind of case that my discussion of apologies was especially, I think, it's what made me think about apologies in this different way. Don't fight about that. Just try to, be better. But over time, one has to get more articulate about it, and so that the news of the changing norms gets settled and broadcast, I guess.
Thank you.
Thanks in part to Professor Wolf's lecture. I'm being primed to see the reactive attitudes of people behind us who would like to move in this room. So to avoid any apologies, and of course to invite her back for the apology lecture in due time, I will do that. I want to first thank my colleagues at the center. I want to thank Meg and Alex for making this event possible, and the whole team. Thank you. And I have no doubt that there's more than one undergraduate who had the experience that I had 30 years ago, and this will expand their sense of the moral world. And I think Professor Wolf does it unlike anyone. Thank you so much.